Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into something pretty major, Trump's presidency, and you know what that means for the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And we've got two really interesting articles to help us sort of map it all out.
Okay, so what are we looking at?
First up, we have this piece from NPR. It came out November 7th, right after the election, and it's all about the immediate reactions from Ukraine, and the potential shifts in U.S. policy.
I see immediate reactions. Yeah, makes sense.
And then we have this other article from France 24. It's from November 16th, so a bit more recent, and it dives into Zelensky's push for a diplomatic end to the war. Oh, and get this, it also talks about North Korean troops getting involved.
Wow, North Korea, huh? That's not something you hear every day.
No kidding. So I guess our mission today is to kind of cut through the noise, right, and figure out what this all means. What are the possible scenarios, and what could this mean for the future of, everything?
Yeah, I mean, the future definitely feels uncertain right now. The whole world is watching to see what a Trump White House means for this this already volatile situation.
Absolutely. And the NPR article really captures that uncertainty. I mean, Zelensky actually congratulated Trump.
He did?
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right? Especially considering their history, the whole 2019 impeachment inquiry.
Oh, yeah, right.
But Zelensky even had a phone call with Trump, described it as excellent. And he even praised Trump's approach. Peace through strength, he called it.
It's a fascinating move.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of suggests a strategic approach.
Yeah.
Publicly acknowledging Trump while also trying to ensure continued international support, especially from the U.S.
Right, because let's not forget, Ukraine's economy is heavily reliant on foreign aid, and a huge chunk of that comes from the U.S., over $108 billion since the invasion began.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is. And the NPR article points out how Trump has criticized that aid in the past. He's even said he could end the war in 24 hours.
24 hours, that's a bold claim.
Yeah, he hasn't really elaborated on how, though.
Well, that's Trump for you.
Exactly. Plus, you got to factor in Trump's past admiration for Putin. And remember, he blamed Zelensky for the war.
Yeah, I remember.
So it's understandable why Ukrainians are feeling a bit uneasy. The NPR article contrasts Zelensky's public statements with the reactions of everyday citizens and soldiers. It's a pretty stark difference.
It's a complex situation, for sure.
So is Zelensky being strategic? Is he genuinely optimistic, or is this a sign of desperation?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure. His position is definitely precarious. And to make things even more complicated, the shadow of the 2019 impeachment still looms over everything.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The fact that Trump pressured Zelensky to investigate the Bidens, that really eroded trust among Ukrainians.
Absolutely. It's a huge factor in how they view Trump.
Right. And that history could have serious consequences. It might embolden Putin.
Yeah.
Make him think he's got a friend in the White House.
Yeah, he can get away with more. Exactly. Or it could influence Trump's approach to negotiations. Maybe push him to seek concessions from Ukraine that wouldn't go over well, both domestically and internationally.
That's a good point. And that brings us to military aid, which is a big focus in the NPR article.
Right. We're talking about a massive amount of support from the U.S., and Trump hasn't exactly been quiet about his disapproval.
True. And what's interesting is how the Biden administration has tried to Trump-proof this aid. The article mentions they've been transferring military training to NATO and allocating the remaining funds before Trump takes office.
Trump-proof the aid.
Yeah.
So what exactly have they done, and how could that impact future assistance?
Well, they've been working on this for months. They've sped up the delivery of weapons systems and ammunition, and they've been pushing Congress hard to approve a big supplemental aid package for Ukraine. They're trying to lock in as much funding as they can before Trump takes over.
Makes sense.
Plus, they've been encouraging European allies to, step up their contributions. But the reality is a lot hinges on the new Congress. And with a Republican majority, well, it's kind of murky at best.
Yeah, that's fair. It does show, though, that the international community understands what's at stake. They know that U.S. support could shrink under Trump. They're trying to prepare.
Absolutely. And it's not just U.S. aid. On top of that, you have the G7's $50 billion loan plan, with the U.S. committing $20 billion. So there's a real international effort to, bolster Ukraine's finances.
It sounds like it.
Well,
which is good, because they're going to need it.
Yeah. And while all this is happening, Zelensky's still holding out hope for a diplomatic solution. The France 24 article mentions he wants to end the war by 2025 through diplomacy.
2025. That's ambitious, considering how things are going.
It is. It raises a lot of questions like, what would Ukraine be willing to concede? How would Russia respond? Zelensky even said they need to understand Russia's objectives.
That's interesting. What do you make of that?
I think it suggests a move towards being more pragmatic, you know? Zelensky knows that any lasting solution has to address Russia's concerns, no matter how difficult that might be.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It also makes us think, what are Russia's objectives in all this? How do they line up with what Ukraine wants?
Exactly. And then there's this curveball from the France 24 article, North Korean troops being sent to support Russia.
Whoa, North Korea. That's a whole new level of crazy.
Right. It definitely complicates things, and it makes you worry about the conflict escalating beyond Ukraine's borders.
Yeah, for sure. This move is directly tied to that defense pact Russia and North Korea signed recently. It shows how much closer they're getting. And that has big implications for global security.
Definitely. And it's not going unnoticed.
Yeah.
South Korea and Japan have already condemned it. It's a sign that people are worried about North Korea getting more involved.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about global power, and the potential for things to spiral out of control.
And just to add to the mix, we have that phone call between German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Putin. The France 24 article mentions Ukraine accused Scholz of appeasement.
Appeasement. That's a pretty strong word.
It is. What do you think about that?
Well, I get why Ukraine would be wary of Western leaders talking directly to Putin, especially with all the broken promises and agreements in the past. They're worried it might legitimize Putin's position or pressure Ukraine into making concessions.
But the article also says Scholz condemned Russia's aggression and told Putin to withdraw troops. So it wasn't like he was giving Putin a free pass.
True. But the optics of that call, especially without any real progress towards peace, are questionable. It risks dividing the West and sending mixed signals to Russia.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? Keeping those lines of communication open is important, even with your enemies. But you don't want to look like you're rewarding aggression or undermining the people fighting for their survival.
Exactly. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Finding a way to engage with Russia without hurting Ukraine's interests or abandoning, the principles of international law.
It's a tightrope walk, for sure. And the consequences could be disastrous if anyone makes the wrong move.
No doubt about it.
It really underscores that this conflict isn't just about territory. It's about these fundamental principles, like sovereignty, self-determination, the rule of law. The outcome of this war, it's going to have repercussions for decades.
That's a good point. This is shaping the world we're going to live in. It's forcing us to really think about power, the limits of diplomacy, the future of global order. These are big issues that we need to grapple with.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive, it feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
But that's okay. Sometimes the most important part of learning is realizing how much you don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's when we're uncertain, when we're asking questions and exploring, that we really start to grasp how complex the world is. And we can start to figure out our own way forward.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a good place to pause for now. We'll pick up this conversation in our next episode and try to unpack some of those questions.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, it does feel like we're at a crossroads, right? And so many powerful players with their own agendas. It's hard to predict what's going to happen.
I know, right? But we can still explore those what ifs, right? Like, one thing that keeps coming back to me after reading both articles, what kind of peace deal would Trump actually negotiate? He keeps saying he'll end the war quickly, but at what cost?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
If you look at Trump's history, his track record, his admiration for strongmen like Putin, it's not hard to imagine him pushing for a quick solution, even if it means Ukraine has to make some tough concessions.
Yeah, the NPR article mentioned Vice President-elect Vance's idea of Ukraine giving up territory to Russia in exchange for peace.
That would be a tough sell, right?
It would. There'd be major pushback from Ukraine and their allies, for sure.
Yeah, it would set a really dangerous precedent, basically rewarding Russia for invading. What kind of message would that send to other countries with similar ambitions? It could totally destabilize things.
It's a scary thought. And it raises a huge ethical question. How much pressure can the U.S. put on Ukraine to accept a deal that might not be in their best interest?
It's a tough one. The U.S. has given so much support to Ukraine, and they obviously want the war to end. But Ukraine is a sovereign nation. They have the right to decide their own fate. It's a tricky balance.
It really is. And we can't forget about the human cost of this war. The France 24 article talked about Bucha, that town where Russian troops committed those horrific atrocities. Any peace deal has to address that need for justice and accountability.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
can't just sweep that under the rug. Peace can't be built on impunity.
Yeah.
You need a way to acknowledge the suffering of Ukrainians and hold those responsible accountable. It's important for healing and for preventing future atrocities.
I completely agree. And just when you thought things couldn't get more complicated, you have North Korea entering the picture. The France 24 article really highlighted how much this changes the game.
It's a major escalation. Sending North Korean troops to help Russia. It gives Russia more manpower, but it also strengthens the bond between those two countries. It's a worrying development for everyone involved.
Yeah. South Korea and Japan condemn the move, and I'm sure other countries are watching closely too. It could trigger a chain reaction, leading to more instability, maybe even dragging other actors into the conflict.
It's like a ripple effect. North Korea's involvement just raises the stakes for everyone. It shows how interconnected global security is. What happens in one part of the world can have huge consequences everywhere else.
That's a good point. And then there's that phone call between Schultz and Putin. Remember, the France 24 article said Ukraine accused Schultz of appeasement.
Yeah, that was a pretty strong reaction.
It was. What do you think about it?
Well, I can understand why Ukraine is suspicious of any direct communication between Western leaders and Putin, especially with all the broken promises and failed agreements. They worry those talks will legitimize Putin or pressure Ukraine into making concessions.
But the article also said Schultz condemned Russia's invasion and urged Putin to withdraw his troops. It's not like he was giving Putin a pass.
True, but the optics aren't great, especially since there wasn't any obvious progress towards peace. It risks dividing the West and sending mixed messages to Russia.
It's a tough situation. Keeping communication open is important, even with your enemies. But you also don't want to look like you're rewarding aggression or undermining the people who are fighting for their lives.
It's a real dilemma. The challenge is to engage with Russia without compromising Ukraine's interests or sacrificing international law. It's a delicate dance.
It is. And it reminds us that this war is about so much more than just land. It's about these fundamental principles, sovereignty, self-determination, the rule of law.
Yeah.
This war will have ripple effects for years to come.
It's a turning point in history. It's forcing us to confront some really tough questions about power, about the limits of diplomacy, about the future of global order. It's heavy stuff.
No doubt. And I don't know about you, but I feel like this deep dive has raised more questions than it's answered.
Yeah, it has. But that's not always a bad thing.
True. Sometimes realizing how much you don't know is the most valuable part of learning.
I like that. It's in those moments of uncertainty when we're questioning and exploring that we can really start to understand how complex the world is, and we can figure out our own path forward.
All right, we're back, and wow, there's a lot to unpack after that deep dive into the war in Ukraine. My head's still spinning a bit.
I know, right? It's like every time you think you've got a handle on things, something new pops up.
Yeah.
It really shows you the complexity of global politics.
Exactly. So much going on, Zelensky trying to walk that tightrope. Trump's unpredictability, the possibility of Ukraine giving up territory, North Korea getting involved, Schultz's phone call with Putin, and the whole global order hanging in the balance.
Yeah, it's a lot. It just goes to show you how complicated this situation really is. But I think one thing's crystal clear. The stakes are incredibly high. What happens in Ukraine will affect everyone.
You're absolutely right. And that leads to the big question, what does the future hold? I think anyone who claims to know for sure is probably kidding themselves.
Yeah, we're in uncharted waters here. But we can look at what we learned from those articles and make some educated guesses, or at least identify some key things to watch.
Okay, so let's play a little game of what if. What if Trump actually pushes for that quick peace deal he keeps talking about? What would that look like? And what would it mean for Ukraine?
That's a good question and a scary one. Given Trump's history, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he'd prioritize a fast resolution, even if it means Ukraine has to make some big concessions.
Like ceding territory, which we talked about could be really hard for Ukraine to accept. And it could have some nasty consequences for other countries with territorial disputes.
Exactly. It sets a bad precedent. And it makes you wonder if that kind of peace would actually last. Would it solve the root problems or just kick the can down the road?
And how would it affect the relationship between the U.S. and Europe? If Trump pushes for a deal that Europe hates, could it break apart that transatlantic alliance?
It's possible. The war's already strained things between the U.S. and some of its allies. A peace deal that's seen as selling Ukraine out could make those divisions even worse.
Yeah, and let's not forget about North Korea. They're a wild card. What if they decide to get even more involved? What if the war spreads to other countries?
Those are some scary what-ifs. North Korea is unpredictable. Their involvement raises the chances of a much bigger conflict with potentially catastrophic results.
It's almost too much to think about, right? But as overwhelming as it feels, we have to stay informed. We have to talk about these difficult issues and hold our leaders accountable.
I agree. We can't just ignore it. The decisions made in the next few months and years will shape the future of Ukraine, of Europe, of the world. We all have a stake in this.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with one final thought.
Right.
What does peace actually mean?
That's a big one. And it's a question we all need to think about. Peace isn't just the absence of war. It has to be built on justice, on respect for international law, on a commitment to talking and understanding each other.
Well said. And as we move forward into this uncertain future, let's keep that in mind. Let's work for a peace that's not just a ceasefire, but a real and lasting solution. A solution that works for everyone. That's a good place to end our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.